Have you ever wondered what goes through the minds of great garden designers as they take the first steps on a new design project? Today we take a behind-the-scenes look at the process of bringing a design vision into reality. You won't want to miss it, so stay tuned as we garden smart from Georgia.
These moments of beauty and relaxation are brought to you by Proven Winners Flowering Shrubs, where every plant is performance tested, leaving you free to just enjoy. Find our award-winning shrubs at your local garden center.
Now more than ever, our homes are our havens, where we learn, love, and live. Let garden projects, inspired or simple, bring beauty and comfort to you. Wherever you choose to plant good, we're with you.
DRAM has been providing gardeners with professional equipment for over 75 years. DRAM products feature 9 water patterns and are designed to nurture your plants with a shower of rain. DRAM for lawn and garden, available at garden centers near you.
You have to rely on your gear. The way it feels, the way it does exactly what you need it to do. The F-Pace, how Jaguar makes an SUV.
Today we return to Gibbs Gardens to follow the next steps in the development of their latest addition to the gardens. The Inspiration Garden is one of Jim Gibbs' crowning achievements, and we've had the pleasure of following its process every step along the way. Last week we dove into Jim's vision for the garden and the early stages of its development. There are so many things to consider along the way, but it all starts with having a vision that can evolve into a plan that can be implemented. We're back alongside owner and founder Jim Gibbs to discuss the process of implementing a new garden design and the many steps necessary to ensure its success. Jim, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Eric. Nice to see you again.
Indeed. Today we're talking about one of my favorite topics, which is starting a new garden. It's us embarking on this amazing new journey, and there's no one I know who has more experience embarking on new gardens than you do. You've been doing this for almost half a century now, and Gibbs Garden is a snapshot into over 20 different gardens, and so the process is one that you're very well acquainted with. And so I'd love for you to talk to our gardening viewers about starting the spark of the new idea for a garden. What are you thinking about?
Well, when I meet with a client, I want to first talk to the client and find out what they want.
Right.
And then after I listen, I usually say, let's go out in your space, your garden space, and let's talk about your space, because that's what we're going to have to be selecting plants for. So once we get outside and walk around, they want all these flowering plants. And we have this fairly large tree in the garden, and it's not a real big residence. It has limited space, but the tree is going to take up the sun. Have you considered removing that tree? If you truly want flowering plants, maybe you should take the tree out. You need to think about these things. So it's a big decision, but if the site's not appropriate, you've got to make it more appropriate if you are convinced you want sun plants or part shade or part sun or full sun. A larger space could actually have 3 groups of plants. One area could be for full sun, one could be for part sun, one could be for part shade. So this garden, of course, has all 3, full sun, part shade, but you have to select the plants for that space.
Absolutely. And thinking about all of that in advance is just one of the many ways that we set ourselves up for success. As we know well, it's very difficult to coax a plant into growing somewhere that it doesn't want to grow. And the sunshade requirements are at the very top of the list of the things that we need to think about, especially when we're embarking on a new garden. As we walk through the process of developing a new garden, we've thought about what do we want, and then done a survey of our sunshade requirements and how that relates to what we want. Another topic that I think is very, very important that oftentimes gets overlooked is topography. How important is that in the design process, Jim?
Topography has to be considered, I think, right up front. If you have a property that has more of a hilly topography, you have some advantages, of course, to that, a lot of advantages. If you're walking on a walkway in that garden, you're able to look down on one side over the tops of plants, and you turn over and reverse your position, you're looking up toward the hill above, and you're seeing all the plants on the levels above. If you're in North Georgia or Atlanta, different places where we are, we have an advantage because our topography varies a lot,
Right.
and it changes with elevations. Every garden is different. You've got the sun requirements we talked about. Now we're talking about topography. So you've got to think about your garden and your topography only. Don't worry about the pictures you've seen. Has nothing to do with it. We've got to think about your garden, what the size is, what the topography is, what the sunlight requirements are.
Right, it informs the way that we even plant the garden. So in the case of your garden that we're looking at right now, this is a dwarf conifer garden, and the vertical slopes have been very, very effective in showing off these plants, and it also allows you to use fewer paths because our range of visibility is so much greater.
Well, as you and I walk through this garden, as you just said, if we look down, look how beautiful looking over the plants is. If we look up, we have all these textures and color. It's totally different. But then for topography, you've got to consider bringing in sometimes a lot of fill dirt to create the walkways. Remember, as we said earlier, the walkways guide you through the garden. So wherever you walk, you're going to see a different view. Looking down is totally different than looking up.
Jim, in my experience, one thing that I found to be a useful way of thinking about the development of a garden is taking it in stages. Sometimes, especially if you're developing a space that's fairly large, it can seem a little overwhelming if we're trying to tackle everything at once. And also gardening can be an expensive hobby. It's also a way of staging out one's budget. There are a number of considerations that need to go into the way that we actually execute the planning part of it, and that would be putting in the big trees first, looking at hardscape and if we want boulders. How have you thought about that in relation to this space?
When you're thinking about a large space or a small space, and I always go back to residential. You're dealing usually with a smaller home or a medium-sized home or a large home, but each one has a certain amount of land that you're dealing with. Select the plants, but remember, certain plants are going to give age and character to a garden. Those larger plants, usually are not that many plants, but cost is a consideration. So you want to invest more money in some of the more important plants. The step-down level of plants are not as expensive, but they of course are more expensive than ground cover plants, which could be 1-gallon plants or 4-inch or 6-inch plants. So I like to talk to people and say, remember, you don't have to do this all at once. Now at Gibbs Gardens, this was a big garden, and of course I even have cost considerations I have to think about. But in the area we're standing in, these larger plants behind us are bringing this lower part of the garden up to balance it, so they balance the topography. But they're very expensive because these are 15 and 20-year-old conifers that are dwarf conifers. So the cost of these and shipping them here is very, very expensive. But can you imagine on this hillside, if everything in this low area was still smaller and we're going down the vertical slope, it just looks like a hillside of a lot of little vertical plants. So we need these bigger plants behind us to give the garden age and character. Now, if you look up, you can go with much smaller plants because the slope has vertical scale, and you're adding plants to the vertical scale.
One way I've thought about my garden in the past, Jim, is putting in the plants that tend to grow slower first. The fast-growing plants, of course, we've got the luxury of time on those, but looking at those more structural, the bones of the garden, and especially if we're on a budget and we can't afford to put in 15 or 20-year-old plants, at least starting with those plants that we know we're going to take a few years to really come into their own, get those in so they can get established, they can start growing and filling in, and then later start thinking about things like perennials, ground covers, annuals. I think it's just a nice way of thinking about the progression of the planting in a garden. One of the most important parts of getting a garden right is site preparation. There's a lot that goes into that. We need to think about kind of the start to finish, right up until the point where we start plugging plants in. And there's a lot of things that we need to consider, Jim. As we think about this site here, how did you go about figuring out what your site preparation was going to look like? What was that chore?
First thing I had to do, and I think you should do on every garden, is decide what is existing, what trees are there, what are the desirable and undesirable trees. Take out all your undesirable. If you have a sweet gum maybe in the corner, the balls can be very messy as they drop. They offer a little bit of fall color, but to me that would not be a desirable tree to leave. So any of the trees, if you have privet hedge, of course to take that out. It's undesirable. You just get the undesirable out, and then what's desirable you leave, and you add more desirable trees and plants to that. And as you go through your landscape design, you're selecting plants that of course are going to have beautiful form, beautiful texture, beautiful color. And then all of those working together will work out for you.
Right, and sometimes we need to also be thinking about what is appropriate for the space. So if we have a very, very small space, yet we have something really, really large that is eating up all the space, and that's not consistent with what we want that garden to be, perhaps that plant needs to be limbed up, thinned out, possibly even removed. And at the point at which we've made those determinations, is it a desirable or undesirable tree, we get to the stage where we do our initial land prep or land clearing. And I know there's a lot of that you had to do with this space.
This space, of course, is a large space, and the elevations are changing as we go up the hill, and we probably have 75 feet of change in elevation from where we're standing up to just the top of the conifer garden. So on the selection of the plants, we want to make sure that as we select the plants, remember, you want to think about the overall size, not just 1 year when you buy it.
Right.
You want to think about what is it going to look like in 10 years. Most plants have a little label on them that will tell you what the size of that plant will be in 10 years. If you're planting a 3-gallon container plant, you would know what size it would be in 10 years. And then you want to put in a space to let it grow to that size.
Jim, after we've done our land clearing or basic land preparation, one thing that's super important is to think about how is this garden going to be used? And the pathways go a long way to determining how people are going to use the garden, even if it's a private garden, but especially in these beautiful public gardens like Gibbs. The pathways it's your way as a gardener of telling visitors, you know, how they're going to experience the garden. So that's got to be done very early in the process.
That's actually the first thing to do after you've cleared the trees. The pathway is going to guide you through the garden. So as you go through the garden, the path leads you in and out of interesting and intriguing spaces, which creates a lot of interest in the garden. I always try to add a little bit of a curve, even in a small garden, just the slightest bit of a curve, and you plant a few evergreens at the end of that curve. It makes you think, what is beyond that? It's intriguing. It lures you into that space and you want to see what's beyond. So add a little mystery to your garden. But in this garden, the pathways were so important because we're winding around following the topography, and we're in certain areas, long distances that are basically level. Then we're going down an incline. But even if you have a small garden, the same thing, as you walk on your walkway, you want to make people look to the right, look to the left, and stop, look at the plant material, check it out.
One of the most important things to think about as well is water. Irrigation is, you know, so important to any garden, and especially with the investment that goes into the plants. If they don't have the water that they need, they're not going to survive. And so thinking about where do we need irrigation and making sure that it gets installed before we even start putting any plants out is so critical.
Get your main lines in. You won't be digging up plants later, putting in irrigation. You need to include it in your initial investment. It's so important because hand watering is high maintenance.
Right. One thing in that same vein that we ought to always think about with a new site is getting the soil right. It's not that we can't make amendments to soil later, but it's so hard to do, and it can be very, very disruptive. And so understanding what the pH of your soil is, getting soil tests done, bear in mind this is going to be the home for this plant, hopefully for years and years and years, in some cases for decades.
As we work on our soil in Georgia, we have clay. I just almost, for every plant, say, look, let's just take the clay out. Dig the hole twice the diameter of the plant. And when you put it in, raise it up a little bit above grade, mount it slightly and put the soil around so the fibrous roots can reach out into that new soil. Get a soil in there that has some compost, some bark in it, a little bit of sand mixed in, a real good soil mix. It's the most important thing you can do.
Another thing I think we ought to think about as we're developing a site before we start moving our plants in is hardscape or other features. So if we know that we want a gazebo, or we have a place where we want to, you know, put some large containers in, or statues, or in this case, these beautiful boulders, it's always better, easier, and cheaper to do that before we have a fully established garden.
These boulders, these are 2 tons, some of them. Don't forget, you got to bury them a little bit in the ground to make them natural. The boulders that are in here have to go in first, then you put the plants around them.
And so this all goes to the bottom line of how important planning is. When we're starting a new garden, thinking through all of these in a sequence, thinking through the process of what needs to happen next, and not, diving too quickly into something that needs to happen further down the line, which, may limit our options and our opportunities in that garden. And so it does involve some patience. This is a garden that you've been working on for years. If we go all the way back to the beginning of when you started the Inspiration Garden, it didn't start with a shovel. It started up in your head, and it started on paper. And because of all the planning that went into the process, you get the results. But the planning can't be skipped. It is a very, very important part of building a new garden. If we get these things right out of the gate, it will save us so much time and so much heartache. We want these beautiful rare plants that we spend money on to thrive in the garden. And with these basic steps, any gardener can be successful at home. Jim, thank you so much for spending the day with us. It's always a treat, and we enjoy so much learning from all of your years of experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for visiting again.
Each week we travel the country north to south, east to west, visiting some of the most exciting gardens, as well as talking to industry horticulturalists about design principles, new plants, and also how you can be most successful with your home gardens. We also love answering your gardening questions, so visit us on the web at GardenSMART.com.
These moments of beauty and relaxation are brought to you by Proven Winners Flowering Shrubs, where every plant is performance tested, leaving you free to just enjoy. Find our award-winning shrubs at your local garden center.
Now more than ever, our homes are our havens, where we learn, love, and live. Let garden projects, inspired or simple, bring beauty and comfort to you. Wherever you choose to plant good, we're with you.
DRAM has been providing gardeners with professional equipment for over 75 years. DRAM products feature 9 water patterns and are designed to nurture your plants with a shower of rain. DRAM for lawn and garden, available at garden centers near you.
You have to rely on your gear. The way it feels, the way it does exactly what you need it to do. The F-Pace, how Jaguar makes it SUV.
Today we discussed the process of the beginning stages of designing and implementing a new garden expansion, as well as many things to consider as the new garden takes shape. Next week we'll continue exploring the process of building a new garden with Jim Gibbs. If you have questions about anything you've seen today, visit us on the web at GardenSMART.com. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. And remember, even if you're a master gardener, there's always more to learn. So join us next week for more great gardening tips and ideas as we garden smart.